there. This is Ajanette. I'm coming back to wrap up our discussions on operant conditioning and different types of reinforcers and schedules of reinforcement. So we have primary and secondary reinforcers, where primary really is talking about kind of satisfying a biological need or an unlearned intrinsic need. Primary often talks about centering on your own body. Secondary is something outside of you, it's secondary to you. So it's something where the value is not intrinsic, rather we learn it. So an example of a primary reinforcer might be water, food, maybe even sex. A secondary reinforcer is something that we learn to assign value to, like money. So those are good examples. Reinforcement can also adhere to a schedule. It can be continuous, where it occurs every time a behavior occurs, or you receive it every time a behavior occurs. Or it can be partial, where you get it sometimes but not for all incidents of that behavior. And so here's a video of Skinner discussing the schedules of reinforcement. I'm going to ask you to pause my video, go watch Skinner. He's actually one of the most famous American psychologists, and he was a brilliant researcher. So it's really neat to get an insight into some of the different things that he did. He trained pigeons to fly bombs during World War II. Incredibly brilliant man, but he did that all through operant conditioning practices. So that video can be very insightful. So he references the schedules of reinforcement in that video, and schedules of reinforcement can be based on a rate of behavior or an interval or time frame of behavior. And again, they're continuous or partial. With continuous, it can, based on the rate, every time it occurs, they're going to get a particular consequence. And it's really, really important that when you're first learning a new behavior or teaching and training a new behavior, that you offer reinforcement on a regular, consistent, continuous basis, so it can increase the speed at which the behavior is learned. Partial schedules are intermittently reinforced. And that means only sometimes when the behavior occurs, they're going to be reinforced. And initially, you want to start out with continuous reinforcement schedules, but gradually you want to transition to partial reinforcement schedules, because although continuous reinforcement is really good for starting a new behavior, partial reinforcement is good for ensuring that behavior persists over time. So it's much more resistant to extinction or being trained out. There's 4 different schedules of reinforcement. Fixed ratio means every time. It's based on, so let me just explain this. Ratio versus interval. Ratio is per behavior occurrence, like a proportion, and interval is for a given time frame. Intervals referring to time intervals. So fixed ratio means for a set amount of time, every 1 behavior they get a treat, every 3 behaviors they get a treat, every 5 behaviors they get a treat. Variable ratio means just that the number of behaviors vary from treat to treat. So maybe it could be the 3rd time, and then the 7th time, and then the 2nd time, and then the 5th time, and then the 1st time, and then the 18th time. But the frequency of behavior or the rate of the behavior varies before the treat is offered. For a fixed interval, it's a set amount of time, like you and I might get paid every other week or every 2 weeks or once a month. That's a fixed interval. A variable interval, if you and I got paid, 1 month, and then next time we get paid after 2 weeks, and the next time we get paid after 3 months, we probably wouldn't work very hard. And so that's kind of alluding to the next slide, which discusses kind of some examples of each of these schedules and their effect on the behavior. So with fixed ratio, it's really, really great for just training us when we're learning new behavior, but we do kind of decline in the behavior just after we get reinforced. So, you know, if we get right after we get paid, we're like, oh, party, we're in party mode, and so we don't work as hard right after we get paid. For variable ratio, then that ratio is now unpredictable, the frequency or number of times that we have to engage in it. And it's not a great way to start learning the behavior, but once we've learned the behavior, it's really, really hard to extinguish. And we see this with gambling. You don't know if it's going to be the next pull or the next pull or the next pull that's going to pay off in a jackpot. So you keep pulling, thinking it's going to be the next time and the next time and the next time. So it's a very, very persistent reinforcement schedule. Fixed interval is again based on a predetermined amount of time or a time interval. And what happens is, right before payday, we start working harder, but then our behavior drops off a little bit, as I mentioned earlier. So this is very common with pay periods. And then variable interval, it's again an unpredictable time frame. Very low response rates. This is probably the least effective way to offer a reinforcement schedule, and you kind of really don't know what to do. But you might kind of follow a slow and steady pattern, because you just never know when the reinforcement's coming. Like pop quizzes, like I never know when one's going to be dropped on me. So I try to just stay slow and steady, like the tortoise and the hare approach. And then the final thing I want to talk to you about operant and kind of classical conditioning is the Premack principle. This is really operant conditioning, not classical, I'm sorry. But David Premack set this principle that if you tie low frequency behavior and high frequency behavior together, or low desirable behavior, and high frequency behavior, you can increase you can kind of use the high frequency behavior to serve as a reward or reinforcement for the low desirable behavior. So I try to make myself, like before I get up for a snack or before I'm allowed to do something fun, like, I'm a Law and Order junkie. I can't watch any TV until I finish my grading or until I do my videos or something of that nature. So the book talks about, like, I don't like to pay bills, and so I can't go out and see my friends until I pay my bills. So it's reinforcing yourself by using kind of really desirable behaviors, withholding those and using those as a reward for once you get done with the low desirable behaviors. So that's why I procrastinate the things I don't like to do. So I use the things that I really like to do as an incentive to do the things that I don't like to do. Premack prevents procrastination. Just my little memory mnemonic there. Finally, punishment's really important. And we need to think about punishment. We're often punishing a bad behavior, and that's often our first instinct, but research on punishment shows that it's not always the most effective. Reinforcement, specifically positive reinforcement, proves to be the most effective consequence at creating enduring positive behavior. With punishment, it's really important that it's used immediately after the behavior. If there's any delay in the punishment from the behavior to the punishment, it actually can serve as a negative reinforcement. I remember my mom used to say, "You wait until Theodore gets home." Theodore was my stepdad, and he would beat us when he got home. But that 4-hour period from the time that we misbehaved till the time that he got home was a reprieve. So it was a negative reinforcement. It was withholding punishment from us. It was withholding something negative or taking away something negative. So we ended up, kind of really blowing her off and fooling around even more for those 4 hours. So when you're talking about punishment, it needs to be immediate and it needs to be really consistent. Very rarely are both those criteria met when we're talking about punishing children, specifically like through spanking. And so often it's not effective. Additionally, when you are talking about using a spanking approach, and that's an aggressive form of punishment, it increases the aggression level of the person doing the punishing, like my stepdad. I remember Ted would talk as he would spank us, and he didn't just spank us. I mean, he used switches from a tree, and we'd have to strip off our clothes, and so it's really more of a beating. And from the first swat, it was a little lighter, but as he was talking and as he was swinging, he would get angrier and angrier, and that switch would slice into our skin because his aggression levels were increasing the more aggressive he was behaving. So aggression is not cathartic. We don't just release it and it goes away. When we act on it, it actually builds and reinforces that aggression. Additionally, aggressive punishment can cause passive aggression to the person receiving the punishment. So I am frustrated. I can't really physically retaliate against my stepdad, so I would use passive aggression to get back at him. I used to be the remote control in my house because back then the TVs were turned by clunk, clunk, clunk. So I was remote control, and I remember disappearing intentionally when I knew his show was coming on, just to get back at him. Like, I'll show you. You have to get up off your butt, fat ass, and turn your own channel. And that's essentially what I did. I was a passive aggressive little brat, but he kind of deserved it. So other things is you engage in avoidance behavior. So you would avoid the punisher. I remember we would hear the garage door open, or we would hear the little truck coming, and we would disappear. Like, we did not want him to have any excuse to spank us, so we just, like, out of sight, out of mind, and we disappeared. Additionally, he was modeling inappropriate behavior, you know, and sometimes we had this, like, I'm never going to be like my mom, I'm never going to be like my dad. And sadly, that modeling is powerful, and that's part of the next conditioning theory we'll talk about. And so we end up growing up and repeating those behaviors. It's hard to break the cycle. I mean, I've done it, but I still have remnants of my dad in me, so I'm very mindful of that. Additionally, we temporarily suppress the behavior. So I might behave, you know, right after my beating, but come the next day, I'm going to go back to being that bratty little Aj that I've always been. You might experience this like when you get a traffic ticket, you know, right after you're pulling away, you're really conscientious, you're driving at the speed limit. And then after a while, that kind of fades and you start flying down the freeway at 90 miles an hour again. And I'm right there beside you, keeping up. And then finally, physical aggression and physical punishment can often lead to learned helplessness. And learned helplessness was studied with animals where they were put in cages and they were delivered shocks, and specifically dogs, and they were given a barrier, it's called a shuttle box, to jump over the barrier and go to the other side of the box where there wasn't any shock. And the dogs that were put into the cages where they couldn't escape shock, they learned to be helpless. They learned that they could not escape the shock no matter what. So no matter how hard they tried, they were stuck being shocked. So they just lay there and took it. And then when they were put in a shuttle box and given the opportunity to escape, they didn't take advantage of that opportunity because of that persistent learned helplessness. And we think that this sense of powerlessness and this helplessness might explain why people in domestic violence situations stay. They feel like there is no escape, and their abuser will track them down no matter what they do. So a very, very complex outcome associated with operant conditioning. And so I'm going to shut the video down, and then I'm going to just do one final video, and that's going to talk about cognitive social learning and social learning theory, and I'll introduce you to one final theorist. Okay, I'll see you in a bit.